For more than 4 decades, Alison Krauss has been known for one thing above all else: control. Control of a voice so pure it seems to hover in midair, untouched by gravity. Control of a violin that never appears to strain, as if the notes arrive already polished. Control of a career that transformed a quiet Midwestern prodigy into one of the most decorated artists in Grammy history. But here's a question worth asking. What happens when someone who has built a life on composure finally decides to loosen her grip on the story? At 54, Krauss has begun reflecting more openly on the chapters she once kept sealed. Her early marriage, her painful divorce, the terrifying years when her voice nearly vanished, and the silence that surrounded it all. For longtime fans, especially those who have grown alongside her music, it forces a deeper question. Was that calm exterior strength, or protection? To understand that, we have to go back to the beginning. Alison Maria Krauss was born in Decatur, Illinois, into a household where education and creativity weren't hobbies, they were daily life. Her father, a German immigrant who later earned a doctorate in psychology, valued discipline, structure, and intellectual rigor. Her mother, an illustrator with artistic roots, filled their home with folk records, the soft twang of banjo strings, and the steady rhythm of acoustic guitar. Their house wasn't chaotic. It wasn't loud. It was thoughtful, structured, quietly imaginative. Music wasn't declared as her destiny. It was simply present, like sunlight through a window. At 5 years old, she began studying classical violin. Not because she insisted, not because she was already dreaming of stages, but because her mother believed in opening doors early. The small instrument felt awkward at first, the bow heavy in her hand. She practiced scales in living rooms and school auditoriums while other children chased fireflies or learned jump rope rhymes. Did she always love it? Not at all. There were days she resisted. Days she would have preferred roller skates to rehearsal. And here's something fascinating. For a while, it wasn't even clear that music would win. She loved roller skating. She was competitive, fast, fearless. She could have leaned into that world entirely. How many lives pivot on small, almost invisible decisions? A parent's suggestion. A contest flyer. A single afternoon that redirects a lifetime. The turning point arrived when she was 8 years old. Her mother spotted a notice for a fiddle contest at the county fair. There was no grand strategy behind entering, just curiosity. A bluegrass instruction book was purchased. A Richard Green album was played on repeat. Instead of reading sheet music, Allison listened. She absorbed. She mimicked. She entered the contest and placed fourth. Not first. Fourth. But sometimes fourth place is enough to ignite a fire. It told her something crucial. She belonged in that world. There was space for her there. Bluegrass festivals became her new classrooms. The smell of popcorn and damp grass. The hum of folding chairs. The buzz of musicians tuning backstage under dim lights. She wasn't dazzled by glamour, there wasn't much of it, but she was captivated by precision. The way seasoned players leaned into each other's timing. The way a single harmony note could shift the mood of an entire crowd. By her early teens, her talent was undeniable. She won regional fiddle championships. Judges used a word rarely given to teenagers: virtuoso. Yet in person, she remained reserved. Observant. More likely to study others than demand attention. It was during those festival years that she met the musicians who would eventually form Union Station, partnerships that would quietly shape her future. They weren't assembling a commercial machine. They were building trust. Night after night. Show after show. Notice something about her rise? There was no dramatic explosion. No overnight stardom. It was incremental. Built in fairgrounds, school gyms, and modest venues where audiences clapped with calloused hands. For many watching, those who've built careers, families, reputations slowly over decades, that steady climb may feel far more familiar than a flashy breakthrough. At 16, she signed with Rounder Records. The label wasn't flashy either. It specialized in roots music. It understood bluegrass. It valued authenticity over spectacle. That alignment mattered. Her early albums revealed something distinctive, a voice that didn't push. She sang like someone sharing a secret rather than proclaiming a declaration. In a genre known for instrumental virtuosity, her restraint became magnetic. By 21, She became the youngest member of the Grand Ole Opry at the time. Standing on that historic stage, she wasn't brash. She wasn't theatrical. She looked almost shy beneath the lights. Yet when she sang, the room shifted. Grammys followed, not one or two, but dozens. Each award could have altered her trajectory, could have tempted her toward trend-chasing. Instead, she remained anchored in bluegrass while gently expanding its boundaries. She collaborated widely, with country artists, folk musicians, even rock legends, yet she never sounded displaced. Then came the cultural earthquake of 2000. Oh brother, where art thou? The Coen brothers film was unexpected. Its sepia-toned landscapes and Depression-era soundtrack seemed niche at best. But the music, raw, old, unapologetically acoustic, captured something people didn't know they were missing. Krauss's contributions to the soundtrack became part of a phenomenon that won Album of the Year at the Grammys and reignited national interest in roots music. Krauss insisted the audience had always been there. The film simply removed the barrier. Think about that for a moment. How often in life do we assume something is gone, when in reality, it was simply waiting to be seen again? By the early 2000s, her professional life looked nearly flawless. Awards stacked up. Her reputation solidified. She was described as meticulous, steady, reliable. The woman who never cracked. But privately, another story was unfolding. In 1996, she married fellow musician Pat Bergeson after a whirlwind courtship. Their world moved quickly, touring schedules, studio sessions, long drives between gigs. Within weeks of deciding, they were husband and wife. Two artists who understood creative pressure. It seemed practical, logical, perhaps even inevitable. Yet whirlwind beginnings often carry their own momentum. Did they truly know each other outside of green rooms and tour buses? Or did the shared language of music create the illusion of deeper compatibility? In 1999, they welcomed a son, Sam. Motherhood shifted her center of gravity. Late-night feedings replaced late-night rehearsals. Tour buses became temporary nurseries. The quiet discipline she'd practiced since childhood now served a new purpose. For a brief time, life appeared settled. But by 2001, the marriage was over. There were no dramatic interviews. No tabloid wars. No public accusations. Full custody of their son was granted to Krauss, and she closed the door quietly. The official explanation was simple. Busy schedules, diverging paths. Yet for those who have lived long enough to recognize the layers beneath polite explanations, it felt incomplete. Here's an uncomfortable truth many in their 40s, 50s, and 60s understand deeply. Sometimes something doesn't have to explode to collapse. Sometimes two good people simply don't fit in the way they hoped. Sometimes silence grows heavier than conflict. Krauss never framed herself as wronged. Never positioned herself as a victim. She chose privacy over spectacle. Stability over storytelling. Why? Perhaps because she had already learned that once your personal life becomes public property, you never fully reclaim it. Perhaps because her son deserved normalcy more than headlines. Or perhaps because composure was the only language she'd ever been fluent in. After the divorce, her focus narrowed. Motherhood became her anchor. She structured tours carefully, balancing rehearsals with school schedules. Hotel rooms held homework sessions. Backstage spaces became makeshift family rooms. Romantic rumors surfaced over the years, including speculation about her close musical partnership with Robert Plant after their celebrated collaboration on Raising Sand. The chemistry between them was undeniable. On stage, they moved like seasoned conversationalists. Their harmonies felt intimate. But she was clear, their connection lived inside the music, not beyond it. For someone whose career depended on emotional openness, she guarded her personal life with remarkable discipline. And for a long time, that discipline seemed unshakable. Until her voice faltered. In the mid-2000s, something frightening began to happen. Notes that once floated effortlessly started to resist. Sustained phrases wavered. The control she had perfected since childhood began slipping in subtle, terrifying ways. Doctors diagnosed dysphonia, a condition affecting the muscles of the vocal cords. For a singer whose identity was inseparable from tone, it was more than a medical issue. It was existential. Who are you when the very instrument that defines you becomes unreliable? She canceled tours. She withdrew. There were months when she barely spoke, conserving strength. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. Imagine building a life around precision, only to feel your own body refusing to cooperate. For someone so composed, this was perhaps the most destabilizing chapter of all. Fans speculated. Industry insiders whispered. Would she recover? Could she? Yet even here, she chose quiet resilience over public drama. Therapy sessions replaced rehearsals. Vocal exercises became daily rituals. Progress was slow, almost imperceptible at times. And here's the deeper question. When your greatest strength is control, how do you cope with something you cannot control at all? Recovery didn't arrive like a triumphant crescendo. It arrived gradually. A note held slightly longer. A phrase delivered without strain. A concert completed without fear. When she returned fully to recording and touring, there was a subtle shift in her presence. The voice remained pure, but there was an added fragility, a lived-in awareness of loss. Audiences felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Her later projects carried that maturity. Collaborations felt less about proving versatility and more about conversation. She wasn't chasing relevance. She was choosing resonance. And as she moved into her 50s, something softened. In recent interviews, she has begun acknowledging the difficulty of those silent years, the marriage that didn't last, the health scare that shook her confidence, the balancing act of single motherhood under public scrutiny. She doesn't dramatize them. She doesn't sensationalize them. But she no longer pretends they didn't shape her. Perhaps that's the most striking evolution of all. For decades, Alison Krauss embodied steadiness. The unflappable artist. The crystalline soprano. The consummate professional. But what if the true story isn't about control at all? What if it's about endurance? What if the calm exterior wasn't armor against emotion, but a container for it? As audiences revisit her catalog now, songs once heard as simply beautiful begin to reveal new layers. Lyrics about longing feel more personal. Harmonies carry echoes of resilience. The restraint that once seemed distant now feels intentional. And maybe that's the gift of time. We don't just change, we reinterpret. So when she steps onto a stage today, violin tucked beneath her chin, there's still that signature poise. The voice still rises, luminous and steady. But behind it lives a woman who has weathered uncertainty, heartbreak, physical vulnerability, and the relentless spotlight of public curiosity. Does the audience hear it? Perhaps not consciously, but they feel it. Maybe that's why her story resonates so deeply now, especially with those who understand that composure and fragility are not opposites. They're companions. Alison Krauss built a life on discipline, artistry, and a near-habitual control that felt, to fans, like part of the music itself. Precise runs, immaculate timing, a crystalline phrasing that made every phrase feel inevitable. But the most compelling chapter of that life may be the one unfolding now. A season of reflection, honesty, and quiet revelation that sits beside the applause and the awards. It asks questions we rarely pose out loud. How much of a life spent shaping sound is spent shaping ourselves? When the instrument that defined you begins to betray you, who are you left to become? The crisis arrived with the kind of suddenness that rewrites routine. In 2013, her voice began to fail, not as a slow thinning, not as the gentle rounding one expects with long careers, but abruptly. Doctor visits, tests, diagnoses, dysphonia. Her throat tightened without warning. Singing felt like pushing breath through a narrow straw. The harder she pushed, the more the voice retreated. Imagine that, the very instrument that defined your identity refusing to cooperate. How would you hold still through that? One moment stands out in the way certain images do in memory. A stage in Utah in 2015. She steps to the microphone. The expected sound simply does not come. There is a silence that is not reverent but raw, and someone else, a colleague, a friend, a stand-in, finishes the song. For an artist whose life had been scaffolded around control and certainty, the experience must have felt devastating. Not only because the voice failed, but because the identity attached to that voice was suddenly porous. Anyone could step into the role if the voice itself was unreliable. But the problem, she eventually realized, was not purely anatomical. It was psychological. A type of singer's block, A boundary around the emotional space performance required that she could no longer pass through. Where she once opened easily between meaning and breath, suddenly each note required negotiation. Force only tightened the throat more, faking steadiness widened the fissure. Have you ever known a situation where trying harder only made things worse? A turning point came in the studio while she was recording what would be known as Windy City. Long sessions that once felt like plumbing the depths were now exercises in restraint. A vocal coach, patient, analytical, watched and listened, and then pointed to something no one else had named: overload. Her body was carrying more than the music. It was carrying fear, responsibility, the weight of expectation. The vocal cords had become a barometer of everything she dared not say or feel. So the cure, counterintuitive as it sounds, was to let the body open in a different direction. Before shows, when panic whispered its old threats, she was told to get angry. Not performative fury but the release of real, uncomplicated anger. Shout until the chest unclenched, expel the pinball of worry by letting the lungs and ribs move. She began to step outside venues and yell, sometimes at trees, to loosen the tightening that had made singing feel like an act of violence against the throat. The image is almost comic, an internationally known singer cursing a cedar at midnight, and yet it is quietly heroic. Strength does not always look serene. Sometimes it looks like admitting you're broken and doing something embarrassingly human to fix it. When did you last allow yourself an ugly, small, private moment to heal? That period of vulnerability attracted surreal consequences. While her public appearances decreased and the space around her grew quieter, someone with a brazen opportunism impersonated her and defrauded an elderly man. The fraudster exploited the very thing her silence had created, an opening in the public narrative. The deception was eventually unpicked, and the impostor exposed, but the symbolism was chilling. At a moment when her real voice faltered, someone else attempted to inhabit her identity and profit from it. What does it mean, in an age of image, when the absence of a voice invites imitation? Eventually the voice returned, not magically nor exactly as it had been, but returned with a different grammar. She learned to approach singing as vulnerability rather than pure precision, to prioritize presence over perfection. The kind of authority that comes from a lifetime of technical mastery yielded, in part, to a willingness to be seen unvarnished on stage. What does it mean to reclaim an art form once it has been threatened by your own limits? And then there is the quieter, equally seismic change, the ending of a marriage. At 54, Krauss did not provide the kind of salacious confession that feeds tabloids. There were no dramatic exposes, no melodramatic accusations. Instead, what appears in the public sketch is a different strain of courage, the courage to acknowledge that something fundamental in the partnership didn't work. Once that truth was clear, she chose clarity over endurance. She preserved her son's life from spectacle. She preserved her work from becoming a stage for private conflict. She preserved the parts of herself that needed quiet to survive. It takes discipline to walk away not because something exploded, but because something failed to fit anymore. How many of us stay longer than we should because of fear? Fear of disruption, fear of judgment, fear of the unknown. How many keep a relationship together because continuity is easier than newness? Krauss's decision reads as a study in self-protection more than self-sabotage. Control had never been coldness, it had been a strategy for survival. It allowed her to navigate fame, heartbreak, health scares, and public speculation without losing her center. What would your life look like if you treated your boundaries as instruments worth protecting? Her story reframes what strength can be after 50. Is real strength the ability to maintain an image of infallibility, or is it the willingness to admit fallibility and to choose a new path anyway? Is it candor, or the stoic maintenance of mystery? In Krauss's case, strength looks like restraint, knowing when to speak and when silence serves you better. It looks like ending what doesn't work without turning it into theater. It looks like teaching a child the rhythms of a private life in public, so the child does not grow up inside the glare. There is also something tender in how she now treats her art. The angelic timbre that has been her calling card remains, but it is housed in a person who has learned the language of limits. There is a humility in that, an acceptance that the instrument and the self are porous, that the best performances may arrive from the place where mastery meets admission. When you listen to her now, do you hear the same voice or the accumulation of years behind it? Do you hear the polish or the weathering? Alison Krauss's narrative is not built on scandal but on stewardship. She has protected her son, her work, and the softer contours of her life by refusing to transform every rupture into spectacle. In a culture that turns vulnerability into content, her quiet is radical. It insists that not everything must be performed for consumption. It also insists that resilience is not always visible, that it sometimes lives in the backrooms where a singer yells at a tree to free her throat. As the audience, what do we owe someone who has given us decades of sound? Do we owe her the safe space to recompose her life? Or do we demand the same notes, the same posture, the same public story? Her story asks us to reconsider how we measure success and endurance. It asks whether we can honor someone's artistry while allowing the human being behind it to change. So when you play her songs now, listen closely. Is it the same voice, or a voice that has learned to sing through the small fractures? Does the silence between phrases carry weight? And finally, what would you do if the thing that defined you suddenly stopped behaving the way it used to? Would you fight to keep the music exactly the same, or would you learn a new song?